Welcome to the Introduction to Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning for Space Biology lecture. In this lecture, we're going to learn some basics about artificial intelligence and machine learning and the way that we can apply them to space biology. Machine learning and artificial intelligence are two different terms for similar subjects. So artificial intelligence is a broader term. It's a field of computer science focused on creating systems or machines that can perform the tasks that would typically require human intelligence. So AI aims to mimic human cognitive functions like learning, reasoning, perception, language understanding, and so forth. And then machine learning is actually a subset of artificial intelligence. So machine learning focuses more on developing algorithms, training models to enable us to learn from data and then make predictions or decisions based on that data. So one of the ways that machine learning algorithms can be really useful in space biology is that they learn patterns and relationships from these large data sets. So like large, complex biological data without being explicitly programmed. So sometimes you don't even need to know exactly what you're looking for in the data. You can just train the model to look for patterns and then examine those patterns. So in biological research, we can use machine learning algorithms like I've just talked about. We can also use AI techniques for language understanding, reasoning, problem solving. And together, these types of techniques help us uncover the biological patterns and complexity that are inherent in space biological data. So we're going to focus in this lecture on the different types of machine learning, more machine learning than artificial intelligence at this point. So there are a few different types of machine learning that are going to be important going forward. And the first one is called supervised learning. So this is where you're training a mathematical algorithm to learn something from labeled data. So when I say labeled data, what that means is you have your data and then you have information about the data. So an example here is you can train an algorithm to predict house prices where you have a bunch of data from houses that were bought and sold, and that data is labeled with features like the size of the house, the location of the house, number of bedrooms, and price. So give a couple of examples at the bottom of the slide here. So if you train this model on a huge data set where the model learns size, location, number of bedrooms, the relationship those features have to the labeled price, then you can give it a new house where it doesn't know the price, it only knows the features, and you can have it predict the price. Another type of machine learning is where the algorithm learns from unlabeled data. So this is data where you just have the data, you don't have the labels. So for example, you could try clustering together similar documents based on their content without any prior labels or categories. All you have is the text information. And then finally, there's a type of machine learning called semisupervised learning, which obviously combines elements of both supervised and unsupervised learning. So this is where you can use a small amount of labeled data, but a large amount of unlabeled data for training. And this is useful when the amount of data that you have to train your algorithm is so huge and unwieldy that you're just not going to be able to label the whole thing. So you can train the model to learn patterns from the unlabeled data and then give it a small amount of labeled data and say, okay, now after training on this labeled data, give me the labels for the rest of the data. So an example here might be if you have billions of email messages, you can learn the kind of patterns that exist within those email messages without even labeling them as spam or not, and then label a fraction of them as spam and train the algorithm to go back and classify those emails. So there are a few challenges that we face in machine learning, both in the broader field, but also these challenges arise in the space biology field. So the first challenge is finding enough data. Sometimes you have lots of data, but often in smaller or niche fields like space biology, you're working with smaller data sets. So machine learning models need a lot of data to learn from. And sometimes it's hard to find data that's diverse and representative of what the model needs to learn. So for example, this is not a space biology example, but if you want to teach a computer to recognize different types of dogs, you're going to need to expose the computer to lots of pictures of different breeds and poses, different backgrounds. So the model's gonna be able to pick a dog out after seeing lots and lots of pictures. So some ways that we can address data availability challenges are to work on collecting more data, either by gathering it ourselves or collaborating with others who have access to relevant data. And there's also a technique called data augmentation, where we can actually create more data from what we have by making small changes to the existing data. Like we can flip images horizontally, maybe we could add noise to audio recordings. So for example, if we don't have enough pictures of dogs, just create new ones by changing the colors, changing the backgrounds, kind of augmenting those images. And these same techniques exist in space biology. And they're a little bit different for biological data, but the idea remains the same. Another challenge in machine learning is generalizability. So if you're going to train a model, you need to make sure it's going to work in all the settings where you're going to need to make those predictions. So for example, if you're teaching a model to recognize cats, but you only expose it to pictures of gray cats, it might not be able to recognize an orange colored cat, for example. So machine learning models really have to be able to perform well, not just on the data they were trained on, but also on new unseen data that they haven't encountered before. And that's our responsibility, making sure that the model is exposed to enough data that it generalizes to all the different settings. So some ways that we can address these generalizability challenges are to do a lot of testing. So make sure our models work well with new data in different situations. We can always adjust the model if we see that it's not performing well in those new situations. And then we might need to get more diverse data. So we need to make sure to test that model of pictures of cats with pictures it hasn't seen before to make sure it can still recognize them correctly. All right. So there are a few key concepts in machine learning that are going to become useful later on. The first one is bias. So bias is error that you introduce if you are trying to address a real world problem, but your model is way too simple. So another way to think about this is if you were to just assume that the average height of all people is about 6 feet, but the actual data shows a different distribution. So that would be a biased model. We want to make sure that we make our models complex enough that we avoid bias. Another key concept in machine learning is variance. So variance is a way of measuring how sensitive your model is to changes in the training data. And so you want a model that is going to be somewhat sensitive to fluctuations in the training data because you want it to be able to pick up on those complexities, but you don't want a model that is so sensitive that it only understands the data that it's seen and then it can't generalize to external data. So a model that is too high variance is like if a person were to memorize the specific details of a story instead of kind of backing up and seeing the big picture and understanding the main plot. So you want your model to be able to see the big picture, get the full context of the data, and be able to apply that to other relevant data instead of picking up on the tweaks or the little idiosyncrasies of the specific data set that it was trained on. So high variance models are known for capturing even noise or just random fluctuations in the data. And this is really important for space biology data because biological data tends to be somewhat noisy to begin with. So this can lead to a model that is overfit to its training data. It only knows the patterns in the training data. So this model becomes too sensitive to these minor variations. So after variance, another key concept is interpretability. And this is, again, extremely important in biology. So we need to know how our machine learning model is making its predictions or decisions. So often in biology, we'll train a model and we'll want to know how did that model classify these samples into groups? What biological aspects or functions was the model paying attention to? Because that'll tell us what's important in the data. So another way of thinking about this is interpretability is being able to explain why an automated system made a movie recommendation. So we could ask it, what were the factors that that model was looking at? Genre, was it actors, was it user preferences? Another key concept in machine learning that I mentioned earlier is the concept of overfitting. So again, these models that have really high variance, that have tuned into noise or random fluctuations in the data, tend to be prone to overfittings. This is where a model is just learning these irrelevant details from the training data. And then because it really focused in on the training data, it has poor performance on new or unseen data. So another way to think about this is overfitting is like when you memorize the answers to specific questions from past exams, but you don't really understand those concepts. You're only going to do well on those questions. You're not going to be able to, since you don't understand the overall concept, you're not going to be able to answer new questions that ask the question in a different way. And finally, opposite of overfitting is underfitting. This is when the model hasn't really picked up on any detail and is too simple to capture the underlying structure of the data. So these are models that have really high bias. We talked about how bias is where you make an assumption about the training data without learning from the actual data that you're seeing. The model's too simple. It also has low variance. And so this ends up with a model that has poor performance on both training and test data sets. So this is like if you're trying to use a really simple recipe with not enough instructions, and you're trying to cook a really complex dish. So this is a model that fails to capture the nuances of the data. All right, so that was a quick introduction to the basics of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We'll be applying a lot of these different concepts in the coming lessons.